So I'm recording the meeting too, so that way that our membership can view it later with the webinar. So they have
Perfect.
So Evan, where are you based out of yourself?
I'm just outside of Philadelphia. Well, that's where our office is. I live in Philly. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Makes sense. Title company.
I don't know. The
Sure.
lazy river sounds nice right about now. We have kind of an overcast, rainy day.
Yeah.
More typical of Oregon, but not in the summer. It's beautiful out there in the summer.
Yeah. So we're on the dry side of the Cascades, so we probably get on average maybe a few thunderstorms during the summer, but we like just regular rainy summer days just rarely happens. So
is that near like Bend?
Yes,
Oregon?
we're just south of Bend.
Oh, okay.
About 12 miles south of Bend. Yeah.
I've never been there, but we have family friends whose parents retired out there, and they have nothing but good things to say.
Yeah, it's a great area, definitely. We're considered the high desert, so we're kind of, like I said, we're on the dry side of the Cascades, but we do get quite a bit of snow in the wintertime as well. It's definitely become a more popular area in the last decade, I will say.
Certainly.
All right. Well, it is almost 11, so let's give them 2 more minutes and we'll get started. I got quite a few people rolling in right now. All right. There are multiple people rolling in, so give me just 1 second. All right, well, we'll go ahead and kick it off. This is our second CMIA educational webinar of 2023. And I'm Keith Caceres. I'm the board president for Community Managers International Association, and also the assistant general manager at Sunriver Owners Association out in Sunriver, Oregon. We want to welcome everyone. Thank you for being available today. And we host these on a quarterly basis through CMIA. And we work with our partners and vendors throughout the year to provide expert analysis and conversation that we want to share with our membership. And we really appreciate everyone for taking the time to be here today. Quite a few of our board members are here today with CMIA as well. And at this point, I would like to turn it over to Mike Hughes with Brown & Brown Insurance. And I'll let Mike kind of kick off the presentation today on cyber security.
Great. Thank you, Keith. And thanks, board members, for allowing us some time to put this together and speak to you guys. It's our second time participating with CMIA in this capacity. You might recognize my face or Brown & Brown or Hayes companies from previous events. We've participated with CMIA in the past, especially with those conferences. Let me try to share my screen here. Let me know. Oh, I think I need to be able to allow screen sharing, Keith.
Yep, it should. You should be good to go.
There we go. Okay. Let me know if you guys see this.
Yes.
Okay. So again, the topic was initially going to be more of a risk management focus, and then cybersecurity kind of came up, and I feel like it's obviously top of mind. And so to that end, we brought in not just me, the broker, from the broker perspective, but we also have Evan Fenaroli here from Philadelphia Insurance, the executive and cyber risk team. So he's going to speak more about the broker or the carrier perspective on cyber risk controls, ways to get in trouble, those sorts of things. Again, I'm Michael Hughes, Mike Hughes, as you might know me, one of the 2 names. I should probably pick one of the 2. I work on the community association practice here for Brown & Brown, formerly the Hayes organization. Our focus is just large scale all across the country. We do have a lot of clients in Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Arizona. But it's just large scale condo associations, high and mid-rise resorts, golf and country clubs, and just true master plan communities. And then Evan, just a brief maybe introduction about your role over at Philly.
Yeah, sure. I've been, and thanks for having me, everyone. I'm Evan, as Mike said. I've been with Philadelphia Insurance about 15 years. I'm in management professional liability team. I focus mainly on cyber risk and technology errors and emissions, but our company at large, we're a property casualty insurer. We write business throughout the country, and that includes condo and HOAs, mainly on the package side, but we also write some directors and officers, D&O and cyber there. So happy to be here.
Yeah, I think you guys probably, I mean, I'd guess half the people on this call have some portion of their package policy or executive risk lines placed with Philadelphia, if not now, certainly in the past. Philadelphia, especially for the package lines and property, is one of the largest and best writers of large scale associations because of their form, specialty services, claims and risk, and then ability to do things like this. Again, just a little bit about Brown and Brown. You know, we're massive. We're about to be the 4th largest in the world, publicly traded. We have a lot of other parts of our organization besides property and casualty, including private client and employee benefits, and a lot of services and marketing access because of our size. Again, I'm representing a team here. So we have the community association practice for the West Coast, primarily of Brown and Brown. We do just medium to large scale HOAs, condos, resorts, golf and country clubs, and we have a ton of services and capabilities, one of which is board education, trade organization education, and the sorts of conversations we're having here. And then to even go finer into it, you know, beyond the team here, we also have this claims and risk platform that we use for all of our associations. And this is sort of what I wanted to touch on, is the idea between a broker perspective and carrier perspective when it comes to risk control and cyber liability for associations. So we're we're trying our best to place you guys with the best coverage that's benchmarked to protect your association. And then eventually, if there is a claim, to help mitigate that by using our claims and risk team license adjusters to make sure that the process goes smoothly. So we basically can do our best to pre-underwrite to find different carriers that might participate and be a good fit, make sure that you guys have best practices in place for controls. Then if there is some sort of a claim, for instance, working directly with a carrier like Philadelphia or someone else to make sure that it goes smoothly and it's in the best interest of the association. So again, we have a ton of resources here, but at the end of the day, it will fall directly on, you know, the association's internal controls for their IT systems, for instance, and then what sort of policy they have in place. You know, we can provide best practices. We have a number of checklists and things that we can do prior to or mid-cycle, for instance, the claims and risk team, you know, not just focusing on cyber liability, but we'll provide these sorts of checklists and guides for all sorts of risks and policies. But as far as what we can do, you know, we can be proactive and help you with these sorts of things and make sure that you are qualifying for these coverages, because, you know, Evan will probably touch on this, but a lot of these carriers have very strict guidelines on what controls must be in place before they release terms, period. We've seen a lot of carriers say you must have multi-factor authentication if you want to quote from us. If not, you have to give us some sort of a timeline that you'll have it in place in 60 to 90 days. So again, these sorts of proactive approaches here, these sorts of checklists and consultations with our claims and risk team to make sure that you guys are considering these sorts of changes in the market, putting them in place to guarantee you'll be able to get a renewal quote or coverage in place. And again, you know, I think from the broker perspective, it starts with our initial consultation. So the strategy, so we'll talk to you guys about what the perceived risk is, what sort of exposure you have for cyber liability, for instance. Again, it's the education portion, things like this conversation here, where we're going to highlight things that might not be top of mind, but are still a risk and would be paid under a cyber liability policy. And then carrier selection. So obviously Philadelphia is a massive writer of cyber liability, but there's other carriers out there too. And so having a marketing team, you know, each broker, not just Brown and Brown, is going to have a marketing team and relationships with these underwriting managers where they have their own underwriting guidelines. So being aware of this, taking that to you, the insured, and saying, are these controls in place? Do you have a third-party IT manager? You should talk to them to make sure these are in place if you want to have terms released. And again, for the broker perspective is, once we have this policy in place, we can only do our best to make sure you guys have as much information as possible about best practices for risk management, whether that's reminders about cybersecurity or any sort of risk management concern at all, claims updates so you can see what sort of actual losses you have. Again, those best practices checklists, those sorts of things, is being as proactive as we can once the policy is in place. So it's marketing, placement, maintenance, and then claims management. So again, we have the claims and risk team, all brokers and any sort of independent agent you work with is going to have a version of this, but someone to be your advocate when there is a cyber liability claim that's going to work on your behalf directly with the carrier, or some sort of third party, maybe a manager of the claim, or someone that works directly for the carrier, a third party. We'll help kind of step in there and work as a liaison between you guys, the carrier, and those third parties. But again, at that point, it does shift over to what Evan will be representing here, which is the carrier that's on the line. So with that, I'm going to go over to Evan's portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Mike. So on my agenda today, and hopefully what you'll all get out of this is just some talking points when you speak with your boards, your property managers, whoever else is on your team. I'll give you a brief introduction, talk about some of the top cyber and data privacy threats, some cyber risk mitigation, and we'll get into some Q&A if anybody has any questions. You can always type that in the chat, and then we can try to answer them along the way also.
Evan, that sounds good. I'll be monitoring the chat on my end, so I can.
Oh, lovely.
I'll break in and let you know.
Perfect. So leading question here, are community associations and planned communities really at risk when it comes to cyber attacks? The answer, as you probably guessed, is yes, they are. I did a very quick search and I found a lot of different articles over the years dealing with whether they're community associations, planned communities, condo associations, various types of data breaches and cyber-related crime. The first one here was from 2020. I'm not going to name them, but they're a larger property management firm for condos, co-ops, I think mainly in the Northeast in New York City and in the metro area. But they suffered a data breach, which exposed the personal information for thousands of residents, employees. That included social security numbers, dates of birth, driver's license numbers, passport numbers, financial information, particularly for co-op applicants, that sort of thing. So obviously a mess for them. It affected not just the property management firm, but all of the condo associations and co-ops that they represented. So something that all of those parties involved had to deal with. Another one here, a case of stolen funds. This one actually had a relatively happy ending, but this was in 2021, I believe, in a large master association in Key Biscayne, Florida. One of the sub-associations had a regularly monthly payment to the master association for use of their pool and other facilities. It sounded like every month they would pay them $100,000. They would normally walk the check down just a few hundred yards away. But I guess somebody received an email that they thought was from the master association saying that because of some extenuating circumstances, they needed the money to be wired quickly. That employee, acting in good faith, decided to accommodate that request, sent the money. It was only after the master association reached out to them asking where the monthly payment was that they discovered that that was a fraudulent request. Luckily, they quickly got the police and the FBI involved and their bank. The bank was able to kind of put a stop to some of the transfers that were going out of the account where the funds were directed. So they only ended up losing about $3,000. But a lot of times when we see this sort of social engineering fraud, it's a lot worse. And I'm sure many of you on here probably, whether directly or hearing from colleagues, might have heard of this sort of thing happening. And then another one, finally, this is from the LA Times all the way back in 2017. Just it was like a regular Q&A column. An anonymous reader wrote in talking about how their HOA website had been hacked. And I guess that this was something that was controlled by the management company. And they were storing a lot of the association documents and other meeting minutes and communications and all sorts of things on there. And this is the direct quote. It caused embarrassing and confidential information to be leaked and destroying our attorney-client privilege in a legal case. That's not good. It caused a huge uproar by owners about the board's cavalier attitude towards cybersecurity, and the breach prompted owners to remove nearly the entire board. So once again, quite the mess. I think what's interesting there is they were mentioning that this ongoing legal case and attorney-client privilege. I'm sure a lot of meeting minutes from condo and HOA boards contain, as they said, embarrassing information that could be used in a legal setting. So it's not just personal information like social security numbers. It could be other secrets or things that individuals or entities don't want to get out in the open. So we can go to the next slide. So when we talk about cyber risk, it's a really broad topic. I like to categorize into 4 main buckets. First being operational risk, and this is one that I think is probably the most important, or has emerged as the highest of all of these. And this is just speaking to the necessity of pretty much any type of business or organization, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's a for-profit, or a planned community or a community association. You need to be able to access your critical data, your software, and your systems daily in order to operate. To some extent, certain organizations can operate without that for a few hours, a few days. They can take certain things offline, but increasingly our society is dependent on data and access to networks. And when that access is hindered in any way or prevented, whether it's from malware or other type of error, that's a problem. Financial risk, obviously the example I gave, theft of funds, wrongful transferring of funds from social engineering, invoice manipulation, or other types of cyber fraud. Privacy risk, this is something that I think as individual consumers, we're probably used to hearing about breaches, whether they're payment card breaches at major retailers, breaches of credit monitoring firms, banks, hotel chains, really any type of organization that collects Social Security numbers, health information, or other private, personally identifiable information. That's also a risk. And then finally, I think another one that gets forgotten about is reputational risk. Some would argue that we live in an era where data breaches are so common that many people may not actually care. But I do think that when speaking about residents or guests in a community association, especially those that may be higher end, or individuals that are high profile or high net worth, they may second guess their decision to buy into a community, to participate on a board, to put their financial backing behind that community. If they've shown, as that last example that I gave, that the board or the management has been cavalier in their approach to cybersecurity. So I think on an individual basis, there really is reputational risk here when there is a cyber incident. So what are some of the top cyber threats that we see? I did touch upon some of them in those examples that I gave, but this is not just a view from Philadelphia Insurance, although it sort of tracks with the claim volume and severity that we see on our cyber book. But the number one issue, and this has really emerged starting in 2018, but definitely 2019 through the present, is ransomware. So ransomware, for those of you that aren't familiar, is a type of malware or computer virus. And the intent of that virus is to lock down or encrypt either specific files or entire data sets or computer systems. And it encrypts them, basically locking out any legitimate users from viewing it or using it in any way until that user or the victim pays some sum of money to the threat actor or the criminal. When ransomware first came around, 2012, I think is some of the first examples. A lot of it was pretty low sums of money that was being demanded. And I don't think we heard about it a lot because businesses and individuals who were being extorted just figured it was easier to pay the money. They would get the decryption key or decryptor tool to unlock their data, and they'd move along their merry way. Starting in 2018, 2019, a lot of these criminal enterprises have really professionalized their operations, and they've shifted more to demanding cryptocurrency, which by its very nature can be anonymous, and really realizing that they had the upper hand here. So it's not uncommon now for ransom demands to be the Bitcoin equivalent of upwards of millions of dollars, depending on who the victim is. Aside from the ransom itself, what we find in these cases is that the business interruption and income loss in that period when the victim is trying to restore their systems, get everything up and running, can be just as debilitating or worse than the ransom payment itself. And I should also say that most organizations don't want to be negotiating with criminals. They don't want to be paying ransom. Insurance carriers, we don't want to be paying it. And most of the time we don't. Luckily, a lot of, speaking to Mike, what Mike was saying earlier, a lot of what we look for on the underwriting side is ensuring that there are adequate data backups so that you can easily restore from those if there is a system lockout from something like ransomware. But we're also seeing the threat actors find other ways to monetize that attack. And that could be threatening to actually divulge the information that they've had access to as a result of this. So it's ever shifting. If there's one thing we know, it's that these criminal enterprises are highly resourced, highly sophisticated. They're not necessarily targeting specific entities or types of entities. They're kind of finding vulnerabilities that are out there, casting a wide net. If they only are successful, the 5-10% of the time, they're still wildly financially profitable. So I don't think it's something that's going away, and it's certainly top of mind for us. The next threat I have on here, data breaches. I mentioned this or alluded to it a little bit earlier. Personally identifiable information, health information, probably not something that most of you are dealing with, perhaps for employees though, and payment card information. Anytime that there's unauthorized access to this personal information, it'll often trigger breach notification laws. You may be familiar with those, but each US state has a similar law that requires that you notify individuals when their information is compromised. Usually requires you to offer credit monitoring and other resources to those victims, in case they become victims of identity theft. There are also some federal laws that come into play, and internationally specifically the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which is relevant because if you have customers, clients, residents of your communities who are EU residents, the law will apply worldwide to their data. So it's something that you should at least be aware of and make sure that you're in compliance with those regulations, both in collecting information in the beginning, but also if there were to be unauthorized access to it. Next slide. The next one, social engineering and cyber financial crime. So that example I gave where the employee in accounts payable ended up wiring funds based on good faith reliance on instructions that they received in email, which turned out to be fraudulent. We see this type of thing happen all the time. Victims are essentially tricked into transferring funds to usually what's an established vendor or other payee. Some of these attacks are more sophisticated than others. Sometimes there's a certain level of espionage that goes on ahead of time to try to understand what the regular monthly flows of cash or payments are, trying to figure out who the players are, trying to mimic the way that they speak in email. Invoice manipulation, this is sort of another way of doing this, and this usually involves an actual somebody gaining access to an email account and then sending emails from that account legitimately, but updating something on an invoice, such as the wire number, the wiring number, the bank account number, and that sort of thing. Of course, that also is an indicator of potentially a wider email or system compromise. But the key thing to remember about all these is that they're often email-based. They rely on individuals, basically our trusting nature in interacting with our fellow human beings and trying to do what they're asking us to do. So the other thing that we're worried about is with AI and deep fake voice manipulation, that there could be some more sophisticated attacks here. The good thing about all these sorts of things is that there are some basic controls that will prevent, I would say, 95% of these attacks. And that could be something as simple as, in the example I brought up earlier in Florida, if the individual in accounts payable had simply called the person who they thought they received the email from and said, I received this email from you. It's unusual. It's not the way you normally do things. I just want to make sure it's legitimate. Call them an unknown number. Or in this case, they were only a few hundred yards away. They could have walked over and asked. But Those types of controls are ways that we can prevent that. And I will say that we've seen fewer of these claims in the past 2 or 3 years than we had 5, 6 years ago. And I think that's because they've been more widely publicized and organizations have become a bit wiser to them. A big theme, as you probably noticed in a lot of these, is email. A lot of cyber attacks originate in phishing emails. So phishing emails are those that are essentially tricking the victim into sharing confidential information, such as usernames and passwords, or clicking on links or opening attachments that have files that execute and then download malicious code or otherwise allow a backdoor for the threat actor to get into the system. They're often used as a springboard for other attacks like invoice manipulation. Email in and of itself is a treasure trove of data. I'm just thinking about my own personal and work email and all of the information that's in there that's probably contains personal or confidential information on clients, customers, employees, etc. And it's all saved there. And once a threat actor or a hacker has access to that, they can pretty much do whatever they want. So business email compromise, that's what we call it, BEC in general, is sort of the nexus for a lot of these issues, and maintaining control over how users access their email, access their systems, their usernames, passwords, and hopefully multi-factor authentication is a big means of preventing this sort of thing. Next slide. A few other ones here to touch upon. So third-party risk. The first example that I brought up with the property management firm in New York that suffered a data breach, that would be an example of third-party risk. So this is just to say that, well, first of all, most organizations, and I'm sure all of you are similar in this boat, but you rely on vendors, suppliers, software as a service, IT service providers such as managed service providers or managed security service providers. All of these third parties are either operating part of your computer system or providing other business process services or other business to business services. And whenever you share data with them, whenever you give them access to your systems, whenever you rely on them to provide software or to provide data backup or other IT services, there's always risk to that. And you're sort of extending the scope of your network and your control over your data and information systems. So in general, when we're talking about a data breach, it's going to be the original data collector or owner. In this case, this sort of example that we're thinking of, it would be the association or perhaps the property manager or association manager that would be ultimately responsible for notifying residents and employees and could face legal action. Those residents or employees suffer damages as a result of a data breach. In a lot of cases, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, but you can transfer that risk to the third party, or you can hope that they'll assume that risk, or they'll indemnify you if you do incur those costs. But the way that the law sees it and the way that the residents who've supplied you their information to begin with, they would expect that you're doing everything you can, not just to protect it yourselves, but make sure that those who are accessing it or handling in any way on your behalf are also protecting it. And then finally, this is a little bit, it's not something that we see a lot of claims on per se, but I think it's worth mentioning, especially as technology continues to advance. It's the idea, or not really idea, the reality of the Internet of Things. This is just to say that we live in a time when more and more devices or things that we use, such as refrigerators, thermostats, smartphones, watches, other wearable devices, all of these things are connected to the internet. They're smart devices. They're smart in some ways. They could make our lives easier, but a lot of times these devices lack built-in security. They're built for convenience, not necessarily for security. They essentially can increase the potential attack surfaces for hackers to get into systems. again, can be used as a springboard for other types of cyber attacks, or shutting down the devices or manipulating the devices could lead to real world consequences. You could imagine, for example, a smart thermostat being hacked into and maybe intentionally or unintentionally setting the temperature at a lower setting than it should be and seeing pipe bursts happen, or something that controls the chemical or the pH or the chlorine balance in a pool or some monitoring device, something similar happens. So you could think of real world physical consequences for these devices. So to the extent that your communities are using these devices, it's not necessarily a bad thing, and it could make you more efficient, can make you more attractive to residents or visitors. But just thinking about fail safes for when those devices either malfunction or could potentially be used for malicious purposes. Next slide. All right, so we talked about some threats, gave some examples from the news that affect planned communities, community associations, HOAs. What are some cyber risk mitigation strategies? Mike in the beginning mentioned that Brown & Brown does a lot on the front end as far as cyber risk mitigation. So just going to dive into some of those that we as underwriters, before we decide to write a policy covering cyber risk, what we like to see. I know Mike mentioned it, I mentioned it just a few minutes ago, but multi-factor authentication has become a big one. Multi-factor authentication is just, other than just using a username and password to log into a service, and that service could be email, it could be your phone, it could be your corporate network, it could be a software or an online web-based service, whatever it is. The idea is that you're entering not just a username and password, which is something that can be compromised, which all of us reuse more than we should. And when we reuse those things, once there's a breach on one website, hackers can sort of buy that data and test out those usernames and passwords elsewhere. And a lot of times they work. So that's how a lot of attacks originate. Multi-factor just adds an additional factor of authentication based on something that you have or something that you are. So something that you have could be your smartphone. It could be a physical device that generates a unique code every time you log in, or it could be something like a biometric identifier, recognizing your face, your thumbprint, or something along those lines. But just that alone is sort of taking care of a lot of the low-hanging fruit for would-be hackers into either personal or corporate networks. And something we particularly like to see it whenever there's remote access to the network. We certainly live in an era where most of us are at least part of the time working remotely. We might have employees that are full-time work from home. We're answering emails at all hours of the day. So just making sure that when people are accessing the network remotely, they're doing so in the most secure way possible, which leads to the next control that I have here, which are virtual private networks or VPNs. Essentially, it creates, you can think of it as a secure tunnel between your home network or wherever you're accessing the system from and the corporate network or the association's network. Usually these are protected by multi-factor authentication. RDP ports. So RDP is remote desktop protocol. This is something that, I mean, it's something more for the IT team, whether that's you have an in-house IT department or an outsourced managed service provider, but making sure that if they are using remote desktop protocol, and this is something that a lot of system admins will use in order to push updates to the system or do other sort of system maintenance. They'll use this, especially when accessing it remotely. And it can be incredibly useful for them, but it's important that those ports, as they're called, remain closed and ideally protected also with multi-factor authentication, because those ports can be scanned because the internet just basically, you can look at all of these, or hackers can look at all of them and identify open ports that are out there, whether they're looking for that particular company or that particular network. And that it essentially provides a backdoor of access. So that's something that you certainly want to make sure are closed and protected. The next one I have here, endpoint detection and response, or EDR. You can think of this as next generation antivirus. It's basically more sophisticated, more fully supported than traditional antivirus that we all have probably had since we've had PCs. A next step from that is what's called managed detection and response, which couples an endpoint detection and response, which is a software with sort of 24-hour support. So when there is a potential piece of malware detected or potential suspicious activity from a user that's on the network, they can notify the entity and help to remediate that, kick off that user, isolate the malware, or otherwise respond to it, as the name suggests. But these types of tools, EDR and MDR, are something that's worth asking your IT teams about, whether you have those, whether that's something that you can look to implement cost effectively. I mentioned before ransomware and how being able to restore from backups is a good way to mitigate the loss from that. So having data backups in the first place and making sure that those backups are segregated from the main online system. And that could mean that they're stored at a separate co-location facility. It could be in the cloud. It could be offline. Offline is really ideal in a lot of ways, because then there's no way that the malware can get from the online system to the offline system. It depends on the data architecture and how everything is set up, but having backups is a good way to make sure that you can get up and running as quickly as possible if there is a ransomware attack or other corruption or malware that affects access to your regular systems. The other thing I didn't mention here is just making sure that that backup recovery procedure has been tested, and that your IT team knows how long that's going to take and what that process looks like. Because no matter what, it seems like these incidents take weeks, if not sometimes up to a month or so to resolve. So even sometimes when there are backups, so making sure that they're current, up to date, and you can restore from them. Regular updates and patching. This is another key risk mitigation control, well, not really control, but a process that your IT team should have a regular cadence or process for updating your operating systems and patching vulnerabilities. So most software out there, including operating systems like Windows, it's made up of millions of lines of software code. Within that software code, there could be errors or unintended code that's in there that can be used to create backdoors into the system or otherwise allow unauthorized access or manipulation of the system that wasn't intended. And that's basically what we call vulnerabilities. So when these vulnerabilities are discovered either by the software engineers themselves that support the software, or ethical hackers, or people actually hacking in and realizing that this is an issue, that's part of the reason why you see software updates get pushed, whether it's to your phone, your own IT department is pushing them, but making sure that you stay on top of that, because what you don't want is to have what's known as a critical vulnerability, one that if it's exploited by a criminal could lead to unauthorized access or a cyber attack. You want to make sure that you patch those as quickly as possible. So just having a process in place and staying up to date on that is crucial. And then finally, on this technology control side, I have secure and encrypted Wi-Fi. I'm not sure how relevant this is, but I imagine that a lot of your communities that you manage have public areas that have public Wi-Fi, whether it's for residents, visitors, whomever, making sure that it's secure in some way and encrypted, because the last thing you want is somebody using it for nefarious purposes or being able to use it and get into your corporate network somehow. You want it to be somehow separate from the business side of things. Make sure it's password protected and encrypted. Now that was just the technology side of things. I would argue that probably the more important side in a lot of ways is the organizational side. Remember, I mentioned that a lot of these attacks result from email and specifically phishing. So making sure that your employees are aware of some of these threats that are out there and that you're speaking with them and ideally even training them regularly on phishing attacks. There are companies out there, I know that we use them at Philadelphia Insurance, called KnowBe4, and they send out fake phishing emails, and it's a way of testing us. And if we think it's a phishing email, we report it, and then they say, congratulations, you figured it out. And if you get it wrong, then they send you to a little training module to say, like, this is what you should look for. Not really a slap on the wrist, but just a fun, easy way to make sure that people are staying up to speed on it. I mentioned before for social engineering fraud, callback procedures. There are other more sophisticated controls that can be in place, especially when you're talking about transferring funds and wiring funds over a certain amount. You want to make sure that there are multiple people signing off on that, that there are ways of verifying, whether it's callbacks, whether it's multiple means of verification. It might even mean getting your bank involved and having the bank independently verify the legitimacy of certain wire transfer instructions. You just want to make sure that you're using every tool possible to protect funds and make sure they're going where you intend them to go. Password policies and privileged access management. This just speaks to the importance of having a password policy, making sure that passwords are updated every 60 days, 90 days at a regular cadence, that those passwords are sufficiently complex. Again, though, multi-factor authentication alleviates a lot of the concerns with passwords. Privileged access management, that side of things, that's just making sure that access to basically individuals and employees, residents, volunteer board members, they only need access to what they need access to. If it's not within the scope of their job or responsibility, they shouldn't have access to certain systems, especially administrative privileges. The more people that have administrative privileges, the more it can go wrong if those people's accounts are compromised. So it's just thinking about that and locking down your systems as much as you can, based on who needs to know and when they need to know it. Data destruction and retention. Speaking to data breaches, you want to make sure that if you're question whether you need to be collecting certain types of information, especially if it is protected information according to breach notice laws. And if you do need to collect it, make sure you have a policy on how long you're going to retain that data and how you're going to destroy it or get rid of it when you no longer need it, whether for business purposes or for statutory purposes. And that includes paper records as well. The last, these next two, incident response planning and business continuity planning. I think this ties in nicely with what Mike was talking about earlier, as far as just being prepared and having an advocate on your side when there is an incident. And I think a part of that is having a plan in place. And it doesn't need to be incredibly spelled out, but you want to make sure that you've identified key individuals within the organization that are going to be quarterbacking the response, that sort of know who to call. That might be your insurance carrier, that might be somebody at Brown & Brown, that might be a law firm or a forensics vendor or an incident response vendor on the tech side, who you have an established relationship with, who knows your systems, who can respond quickly. But just making sure you know who's going to be in charge. If that person's on vacation, not available, whatever, who else can step into that role? How are you going to deal with it? Because that will alleviate a lot of stress and will make the whole process run a lot smoother. The last thing you want when there's a ransomware attack is to not know who your insurance carrier is, or who knows your insurance carrier is, or how to reach Mike or the people on his claims team, et cetera. Business continuity planning, sort of the other side of that. When the system is down, when you can't access this, how else can you continue operations and make sure that your most critical functions are carrying on? That doesn't mean that everything can be shifted offline, but make sure you've thought about that and what that looks like for if you're down for a day, if you're down for a week, if you're down for a month. And then finally, vendor audits. Basically, whenever you're sharing critical information or a vendor or software provider you're outsourcing a critical piece of your IT infrastructure to them, make sure that there's some process to audit them, to make sure they have sufficient security standards, that they're making representations that they're going to protect data and that sort of thing. So you can mitigate that third-party risk that I mentioned earlier. All right, next slide. All right, and the best part here is cyber risk transfer. So we've done what we can to mitigate cyber risk, but we know that it still exists. We can't avoid all of it, but we can protect it. So one piece of that is contractual risk transfer. I mentioned earlier third-party risk, and this is what I mean by it, is ensuring that vendors are assuming liability for what's within their scope of operations and responsibility. So essentially, if you have a professional property manager that's handling, for example, payments of HOA dues or association dues, whether that's monthly or annually. Obviously, it might be through electronic funds transfer, it might be through credit card payments. They're using either their own in-house solution or they're outsourcing that to another vendor. If there is a breach of that information, or if there's an issue with payment, whether it's a payment card breach or somebody gains access to that and transfers funds, unauthorized funds from a resident's account, you want to make sure that that vendor is going to take responsibility for that loss, even though maybe it's the association that initially could be held liable or could have collected that information from the get-go. As much as you can encourage or negotiate these contracts in your favor, that will help in the long run. Even if the organization or the organization's insurer ends up having to pay some costs out of pocket in the front end, it gives you a means of recovering from that third party if and when something goes wrong. And the same thing goes with hold harmless and indemnification clauses. Making sure you have those in your favor to the extent that you can will also help. But the big thing that we're here to talk about is cyber and E&O, cyber insurance, but I'll also talk a little bit about E&O or professional liability. So I'm not sure how many of the associations on here actually purchase cyber insurance. If you do, you might be aware of all of this. If not, just a quick primer. Cyber insurance has been around at least since 2003-ish, and that's when California, they were the first state to pass a breach notice law. But since then, it's grown to become more or less a standard line of business, although there's still a lot of specialization, still a lot of innovation in the field. And it's been a somewhat volatile market, to be honest, over the past several years. And that's mainly because of what we've seen with ransomware. Before we had a lot of ransomware crisis, I would say it's a very soft buyer-friendly market. The market hardened substantially. But I think we're actually at a very good place now. And part of that is that we, the carriers, have sort of focused in on which security controls and questions, which controls we like to see in place. And we've seen that lead to substantial improvement in the claims that we see. So it's something you should certainly consider buying. It'll protect you from a lot of the risks that I've talked about, especially if you're well prepared as an applicant. But it generally covers two big buckets of risk. One is first party, so that would be the association's your own direct loss or expenses when there's a cyber incident. So that could look like breach response costs, meaning bringing in attorneys that are specialized in data and privacy law, bringing in computer forensic experts, incident response vendors. If you do have to notify residents or employees that their information was compromised, it'll pay those costs. It'll cover credit monitoring costs. If there's ransomware and it's determined the best course of action is to pay that ransom to get that decryption key, we'll pay for those extortion payments, business interruption, extra expense, data restoration, all of those sorts of things. On the third party side, this is when there's a claim or a lawsuit against you, the insured, alleging something having to do with the cyber incident. These insuring agreements, what we cover here is very broadly written. So it could look like, and it usually looks like an employee or a client or a customer whose information was breached and they allege some type of financial harm or damage as a result of that. But it could also be a claim from a third party. alleging that your failure to protect your own computer system ended up negatively affecting them. Maybe, for example, an employee forwarded an email with an attachment that had malicious code that ended up leading to a cyber incident at the third party. So it could be a lot of things, but it's going to cover lawsuits. It will pay for defense costs, and will pay to settle those claims or pay any judgments if it does go to court. Finally, errors and omissions. This is otherwise known as professional liability. This is something that's probably most relevant to third-party property managers. And I'm not sure if any of you are property managers specifically, or if you're using third-party property managers, but either way, it's important for those property managers to have E&O in place, because where cyber insurance is really covering the insured's own network and their own data and their ability to respond to that, the E&O is going to cover the professional services for service providers' failures in rendering professional services. So by that, it could look something like the property manager failed to advise the board on purchasing cyber insurance in the first place, and they suffered a breach as a result, or the property manager failed to properly vet the IT vendors that the association chose to go with, or the property manager themselves was responsible for managing the website or the portal that residents use, and that portal itself wasn't protected and was compromised and suffered a cyber incident. So usually these two lines of business go hand in hand, and there can be some gray area between them. So I think it is important just to make sure that whether you're on the property manager side or the association board side, making sure that the property manager has that coverage as well. So that was a lot of me talking. Mike, I don't know if you have any other closing thoughts before we get to questions.
No, I think we're ready to ready to take some questions. If you had anything, Keith, board members or attendees from CMIA. I know there's a lot there, and it's not always the most exciting topic, but I'll just say anecdotally, I went to we have a 9-person claims and risk team to sit down the hall. They said they've done nearly 40 cyber claims for insureds just in our office this year alone. So it is obviously top of mind, and it's something to be concerned about. I mean, just in our large scale plan community book, we've dealt with a number over the last 2 or 3 years, and it's just, it's good to be as prepared as possible. That's what I've sort of noticed. We do our best to help, and then obviously Evan and his team and the carriers that participate on these sorts of coverages are vital. Any other questions from the board or the attendees in the board?
Feel free, each of you all, to speak up and unmute yourselves. This is great information that was shared today by Mike and Evan. Just to let you know, we as Son of Our Owners Association went through a cyber claim back in 2018 ourselves. So it is real. It happens. And Mike and his team did a great job of mitigating the future expenses that were tied to it. But it was a loss in business activity. It was multiple things were basically put us in a position where we could not operate and function. So it was pretty scary, but the good thing is we were able to get through it. And now we have a lot more safeguards in place due to that. And also we have a new IT director who's done a great job. She's got a lot of experience in cybersecurity as well. So combination of that and working with our insurance provider has been a big help to us. It looks like we have a chat from Kelly. She says, can you provide additional information regarding auditing our vendors? Like, is there a handy checklist available? Who wants to take that question?
Yeah, that's carrier specific. We have our own cyber controls checklist. Every carrier's got their own. They'll put their logo on the top about what their wish list is. We can hand that over to, this depends if you guys have an internal person that's an employee of the association, or you utilize a third party, for instance. Usually it's that sort of checklist is handed to them, and it's almost like a homework assignment. At least that's how we view it. Typically it's done prior to renewal, but you could do it midterm too. If you just want to take a snapshot audit of your existing controls, you can talk to your broker or your carrier and say, can you provide me a checklist or a wish list of the things you want in place to best protect us? Take that to your internal person or the third party, and then they can go through that sequentially and see what's in place. But again, that's, that's expected at this point, especially for anyone that works on behalf of the association. If that's a third party, that they know that, they're expected to have these sorts of controls to protect you. So usually it's, we've had a few that have been a little contentious where we've had the third party say, I've never had to, this is not reasonable to have this in place, but at a minimum, it's, it's a reminder for them that things are changing. And then just because it's appearing to be safe, the lack of a certain control might preclude you from having coverage in a future renewal. So it's good to be as proactive as possible and just put the bug in their ear that, yes, there's going to be some requirements and changes to bolster your security in the future. But yeah, every broker, every carrier is going to have a checklist like that and can walk through the process with their insured.
Well said. Nothing to add.
Excellent. We're getting a lot of chats saying great presentation, so that's wonderful to hear. Jeff Evans, I got a quick question for you. Based on the community you've worked with, you've worked with a lot of large-scale communities. How many of them would you say have cyber insurance, or you're aware of cybersecurity insurance?
Oh, I think it's pretty common today. Fortunately, many of them are insured by Brown and Brown and companies like that are certainly encouraging them to get that. Even my son owns a small landscaping business, and even he has that coverage. So I think it's I'd be concerned if you're managing a community that doesn't have that coverage. I would really look to get that to cover yourself and cover the board.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeff. Other questions from the group that's on today? There's Evan and Michael are still here to provide answers for you. Let's see. Sounds like quite a few people are taking some good notes. One thing I do want to let the group know is that on our CMIA website, this presentation will be available shortly. So those that have questions and want to go back and review some of the slides, these slides will be available for you to view on the CMIA website in the near future. Next couple of days, hopefully.
I just want to tell Mike that he can tell his dad that he did a better job than his dad did. So
Excellent. I'll take that
it's
with
nice
me.
nice to see you, Michael, and certainly pass along our regards to your mom and dad.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, well, it looks like just getting a lot of great compliments once again. I don't have any other additional questions right now, but I think this was very important for each of us as managers of these large scale communities to understand that this is a significant threat, but there are ways to mitigate them. And then there is help on the insurance side as well. Once a claim is processed, how to go through those steps. So thank you, Evan and Michael, for all the great information. I think it's something we will all want to continue to review, especially if the situations ever arise in the future.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you,
Yes,
guys. We
of
appreciate
course.
the time.
Sure. And one last chance. Any other questions for Evan or Michael? All right. I don't
All
see.
right.
Just want to say thank you all for attending today, and watch out for some emails coming out soon from CMIA for our next quarterly webinar.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.